sorry about this actually belated, start actually cause of a technical problem. We're gonna actually start, this talk soon. Today we invited Gregg Lambert, the professor in Syracuse University, America. And then actually today's host is Manoji from India. So he gonna actually introduce him and then his work, and then a topic we're gonna discuss today. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, and thanks, Geoff, and thanks, Gregg Lambert, for joining us. This is our third lecture of GCTH lecture series, and we started off with none other than Sisek talking about his book, Hegel in a Wired Brain, and then we had Jan Buchanan discussing his recent book on assemblages. Today, we have Professor Gregg Lambert, and we will be having a discussion on one of his very recent books, The Elements of Foucault. Gregg Lambert is the Dean's Professor of Humanities at Syracuse University and Distinguished International Scholar at Kyungshu University, South Korea. He's a founding director of the Syracuse University Humanities Center and the Society for the Study of Biopolitical Features. Lambert is the author of 13 books, and some of the more recent books, including this one, are like In Search of a New Image of Thought, Gilles Deleuze and Philosophical Expressionism, and Philosophy After Friendship and Deleuze's Conceptual Persona. And then there's one more book to come, I guess. Yeah. And this book, Elements of Foucault, let me just say a few words about the book. I consider this book as a very timely one, and the relevance of the book can be explained on two grounds. The relevance in further extending the discussion on biopower, biopolitics in the context of pandemic, which help us to rethink the mechanism of subjectification that is in the context of various biopolitical dispositives employed during the time. Second factor is that also the claims, not just a mere commentary, but undertakes a reordering of the existing discursive grouping of Foucault's project. The new body of lectures, published posthumously, produces the possibility of formulating fresh propositions, striking a different archaeological ordering of different stratas producing discontinuities, which instigated the author to come up with 4 phases of Foucault. First phase concerning discursive practices and history of representation. Second phase concerning microorganization of power. Third phase concerning repressive hypothesis and dispositive sexuality. And the fourth phase of biopower, which articulates a new perspective on power. These books focus on the mutation of biopower, focusing on the elements of method, dispositive, creed of intelligibility, and milieu. Now, let me just open the floor for discussion by asking Gregg to have an initial response to introduce the book. Over to you, Gregg.
Well, thank you. Well, it's also thank you for inviting me to participate in this series with longtime colleagues and friends like Alex and Geoff and Manoj. Well, I don't know how you want me to begin to discuss the book, but I can give you some context about the origin or the genealogy of the book, which is, it began in the context of a larger collaborative project called the Society for Biopolitical Futures, which I started in 2013 with Kerry Wolf at Rice University, who is well known for his work in animal studies and post-humanities, as well as other figures like Jeff Nealon, Claire Colebrook, Paul Patton, a host of other people that then became involved in the project. And it really was, it was motivated by my perception, as well as the discussions that I had, that the concept of biopolitics had become too inflated, too widely understood in different ways, that in a sense departed fundamentally from Foucault's, from really the origin of the term, the origin of the concept, from Foucault's own methodology. And in doing so, it was plugged into all kinds of things, particularly the critique of neoliberalism, under the influence of the very strong influence or prominent influence of Gilles Deleuze, who I've also written about quite a bit. But his early book on Foucault, as well as a very short text that he wrote on the postscript on control societies, which in a certain way shaped the entire reception in the United States and in the UK of what biopower or biopolitics was. And the other major influence, of course, was Giorgio Agamben and his Homo Sacer, who launched a bit of a critique, or in some way a very revisionist understanding of Foucault's concept of biopolitics, in a way that fundamentally distorted what its origin, what its purpose was. So the Society of Biopolitics wasn't a hermeneutic project, but it was in a way to gather together a lot of scholars who have been working on this concept in very different disciplines and fields in order to come together and create some sort of consensus about what the concept was, what its genealogy was in terms of the origin of its genealogy in Foucault's work, how it has evolved in some ways well beyond Foucault and is doing important work in different disciplines and different fields, and mutating in some ways in a biological sense. We thought about that in a more of a biological sense. There's no origin of an organism. There's only a norm that continues to evolve. But also to think about critiquing or reining in some of the different interpretations of the concept that would lead it astray to certain degrees and wouldn't be as productive. And so this project engaged in over 5 years, about 13 to 14 different conferences and papers or sessions all over the world. I mean, Australia, Italy, other places like that, where we would keep continuing to gather more and more people who have been working on it, like Miguel Vater in Australia, in political theory and political science. And in doing so, it created a really vibrant sort of conversation that really, the purpose of the conversation was to feed our own work and our own research. And so there were two stipulations when I formed the Society for Biopolitical Futures, is that there would be no collected volume or journal that would come out of this project. It would not become an academic, kind of a standard academic productive apparatus, but that it would, in a sense, only stimulate a certain number of conversations that would feed back into the research of the individual members, which it did. And the second was that in 5 years, the society would be disbanded or closed. And so we basically ended the society, or I ended the society at the Toronto meeting of the Society for Literature, Science and Literature at Toronto, and that was in 2019. So this book, my book, comes out of the series of a lot of essays and the research that I did in relation to this group over that 5-year period.
So I still remember that the conference in Turin, Sarsa. Yeah, also
in Italy.
Italy, Torino. So you also actually they showed your interest in the biopolitic there. It's a kind of the series of your research.
Yeah. Well, I had been writing on Foucault, I mean, pretty extensively, or reading Foucault over 30 years. In relation, the earliest writings on Foucault are in the book called The Return of the Baroque, and but they dealt with more the earlier period, the Les Mots, les choses, the order of things. But I became very interested I'm very interested in the question of method. In philosophy generally. A lot of my work is on the question of method in Deleuze, but Foucault's a fascinating figure for this. I'm also attracted to systems of thought or particular philosophers who are very controversial for very strange reasons, that they promote very antithetical interpretations of them. So you remember in the last several years, a very dominant interpretation that Foucault is a neoliberal or neoliberal apologist or a theorist. Earlier than that, that he's a neo-colonial theorist. I mean, there were, you know, it's the long tradition of anti-Foucault theory. And even there was an early book called Forget Foucault that came out, you know, very early on. So I was always interested in, as well as with Deleuze as well, but interested in those systems of thought, and we can trace them even earlier to Nietzsche, to Spinoza, certainly, that provoke extremely antithetical and polemical responses to them. So that's where the question of method comes in for me as a kind of guiding thread or a way of leveling the debate in order to understand what is the real issue underlying the controversy. So.
Geoff, do you have comment?
I was just thinking that, just remembering when I was a student in the 90s, and then early 90s, and then it seemed to me like Foucault fell out of favor a little bit. You know, with the Derrida became really kind of, you know, and then Deleuze was still there. So I was wondering, like, in the 80s, he's, you know, Foucault's extremely famous, and he came to Japan, and, you know, this kind of, you know, this idea. And then in the 90s, he seemed to fall away. You know, I always wondered why he wasn't used as much as he should have been. And then recently, he's come back into kind of, especially with the publication of the 4th volume of the History of Sexuality, he's kind of come back into the debate. I just wondered why he kind of faded away. Do you ever have a thought about that? Or has he? I mean, I might be just wrong, you know.
Well, John, I mean, you have to look at the reception of Foucault outside of one national context or one historical period, because a lot of his early work, but he emerged in, I mean, one of the problems, and I deal with this in the introduction of the preface, I call it the 4 ages of Foucault, but his work was received and translated in some ways out of order. And the certain disciplinary logic. So if you talk about the 80s and you were in, where were you at that time?
I was at Warwick in the UK in the 90s.
So most likely that there was during the period of the 80s, the Foucault that became very prominent during that period, the work of, like, What is an Author and the Order of Discourse, and which was determined or received as a kind of like structuralist or post-structuralist Foucault. But mostly had to do with hermeneutic, interpretation, theories of interpretation of the constitution of the authority of the author or of the literary canon. At least in the United States in the 80s, when I was also, you know, in graduate school, that was the Foucault that was read prominently, as well as alongside the order of things, you know, that was read in the area of history. It was very influential in the birth of new historicism in the United States during the 80s, during that work. The problem is that his work, you know, was translated at different moments and then came into prominence within a disciplinary discourse, a particular disciplinary discourse within a national context. So if you look at other countries like Korea, or if you look at the United States later, the later Foucault in the early 90s was more associated with discipline and punish, and the theory of discipline and of the panopticon. And the disciplinary rubric or the regime, the disciplinary regime that became prominent during that time was more in the social sciences than it was in the literary studies and the humanities and in philosophy. So at that time, in the 90s, Foucault kind of fell out of favor in one discipline and then rose prominently, particularly in the area of social sciences and in political theory, with the theory of discipline. And then he kind of waxed and waned during that period of time. But it was really the real explosion of the Foucault studies, let's say, and that there's a journal called Foucault Studies as well, and a whole battery of scholarship or a range of scholarship around this that emerged only after 2000, was with the unauthorized translation and publication of the lecture courses, which began with Society Must Be Defended, and then led through to the most recent, the most recent is The Birth of Biopolitics and the other lecture courses. But these are lecture courses that occurred from the 1970, the mid 70s, right? Security, Populations, and Territories, 1978. Birth of Biopolitics. So these are all names that were given by the editors, by Daniel Defer. Foucault had left in his will that he never wanted these ever to be published. And so, as in many cases, he was ignored at some point. And this became a huge industry, let's say, scholarly, that transformed all of the earlier interpretations of Foucault. Right. They were all guided, one, by the works that had been published and translated in the different languages at different times in different nations. And two, if you remember Deleuze's famous commentary talks about a huge gap or silence in Foucault's discourse because they were only counting the books that were published, and Foucault was not publishing the books. I mean, the fourth volume of History of Sexuality was actually supposed to be all one volume, right? You know, according to Foucault's early plan. So in a sense, this filled the gap and then created a huge kind of new enterprise, so to speak, scholarly, to recover a certain kind of Foucault, to fill in the gaps and to completely revise and reinterpret his entire oeuvre from the perspective of the lectures. So that's before you had the early, I mean, at least in the US and the English translations, including the UK, you had the archaeology of knowledge, you had the order of things, then you had a series of essays like the What is the Author, then you had the collections like Knowledge and Power, and some of the interviews that were published, and then History of Sexuality, Volume 1, 1975, and then Discipline and Punish. So all of these books came sequentially, but kind of in a certain way out of order, and created a very false understanding of Foucault's entire oeuvre, his entire project.
So actually, when he started his lecture series, Collage de Français, he was involved in the prison information group.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of activity, all right, is sort of, it's not really the stuck to his early work, but rather kind of his own liberation, from his early structuralism. Mm-hmm. And then actually after the first lecture, he went to the Iran, and he also found out the kind of theoretical foundation there. So could you my question is that what kind of actually clue he got to the link his first early work and later work is of course, yes, it might be a break or some linear the continuity is between the two parts. What do you think about
I think that there's a strong continuity because he The Birth of the Clinic was a very early project. Mm-hmm. And he was always concerned with the status of the asylum, the mentally ill, these institutions of discipline, and of the subjects that are located there, certainly the penal system and of prisoners. In France, he became involved with the GIF as a result of that, but he was always very actively involved also with the question of sexual rights, groups, sexual rights in French society. In a very homogenous and dominant Catholic society, he became very much of an activist in that area. But it continues from his theoretical or from his early historical work on the development of the disciplinary orders of the asylum and the prison, and of the subjectivity of the discipline that emerges in the discipline and punish. He had a very strong, I mean, not many people know this, but he spent an early part of his career actually outside of France in places like Sweden, in Linköping. He was he was a professor there. He was also the director of the French, basically I can't remember, the Society Française in Poland, at Warsaw. And so he developed a lot of very strong contacts with international students. Particularly, he was very interested in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc for questions that concern the difference between the development of the Eastern Bloc societies after communism, or even in the midst of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the democratization or the lack of democratization of those societies, or the different relation of, he was more interested in the epistemological questions of how the disciplines and particularly the sciences evolved in those societies and universities as compared to the Western societies, and particularly France and the United States. And so he had a very comparative approach to the very notion of episteme. That's fundamentally a question for him, and how the episteme organizes and basically also houses a relation to the state and to power, to knowledges of power, discipline, techniques of power, and how they first develop in relation to the university systems there. And so how the Soviet bloc's universities differ from the sciences humaines in the French society, or in the French universities. And to some extent, he also in 1978 went to Japan and was very influential, or very actively participated in a number of discussions there, both with academics or intellectuals and also activists in the Japanese society. And so he was a very active intellectual globally. That's not really well known among people who don't really know his work that well. So.
Oh no, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Greg, am I audible?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in one of your, and it's interesting that this book is published in the post-humanities series. And I was looking at the larger milieu in which Foucault's discussion is also kind of caught in this book. In one of the references, you make a point that, like, in the relation between the mechanical analogy and the organic analogy, you say that it's not a displacement. It is something congruent to each other. But at the same time, while I was reading The Grid of Intelligibility, wherein which you kind of explain at length, wherein which the non-economic sphere of life is being explored, is in terms of like the different schools in German, like you were talking about different schools, it's like Ordo-liberal German school against the Chicago school, wherein which you kind of explore the possibility of non-political sphere of life, that wherein which you say something, what you call, wherein which Foucault tried to explore the life, the bios in that sense. But what we are in the context of global post-humanities, what we are right now facing is a different conception of bios, like, much more exploration into the microbiology, you have astrobiology, all those sort of areas wherein which the question of bios is being raised, or the question of life itself is being raised in a different perspective. How do you look at that sort of developments, especially in the context of global post-humanities from a Foucauldian perspective?
That's a very good question. I mean, in some way, my first question would be, what is the relationship epistemologically of the humanities to the development of these sciences of microbiology and so forth? Oftentimes, and this is one of the critiques, that the history of sciences themselves have an internal history and a genealogy that they develop in relation to the universities, in relation to their disciplines. And so new areas of knowledge and inquiry oftentimes are not accepted within the traditional fields. Foucault's famous example is the emergence of biology in the 19th century, as that displaces the previous knowledges of philology and certain kind of Aristotelian notion of life that had dominated the academic knowledges previously.
Taxonomy. It replaced the taxonomy.
Yeah, the taxonomy. Yeah. So he also, though, points out the predicament or the problem, the precarious relationship between the dominance of the emergence of the biological disciplines that replaces in many ways all of the other sciences as a dominant discipline, providing then a powerful analogy for political, for both ideology and political forms of organization. So in other words, biology becomes the dominant master discourse that in a sense is imported into political science and other sciences in order to recode their understanding of what power is and how it functions. Functions according to a biological model. I see that how Foucault would respond to this is that these transformations epistemologically, which seem revolutionary, when they enter into the humanities, they become ideological. And in doing so, they become highly reflexive, and in some ways they appropriate the knowledge of the epistemology of the sciences for another end, which serves more of a political, which serves a kind of ideological representation of a new technique of power that's based upon the studies, for instance, of the new forms of life, microbiology, So this becomes a very precarious moment in the history of the transformation of a certain kind of connaissance, or that's what Foucault called an episteme, right? This emergence of a new paradigm, let's say. So biopolitics that's one of the questions that our group raised, was how biopolitics suddenly exploded outside of the framework of Foucault's work. It wasn't even applied in the way that he understood it, to pertain specifically to the emergence of a certain set of knowledges having to do with security and economics and labor and juvenile delinquency and childbirth statistics in the 18th century. Suddenly, this concept, as well as this area of knowledge, the paradigm of biopolitics, exploded and crossed over all of these different disciplines at the same time, and it replaced the idea of structure with an understanding that power functions in this way. And in doing so, it represented power relations through this lens, as well as through these disciplinary knowledges. And so this became a very much of a problem for me and for the group to try to resolve in what way is this a misappropriation, in what way inevitably Foucault talks about the passage of the historical passage of truth philosophically is always retroactive to the actual invention of knowledge. And that's the question of the organism, it's a question of mechanism. In other words, the manner in which other disciplines represent new knowledge oftentimes functions in a purely ideological manner.
So you actually discussed that one in the chapter, is greed of intelligence.
Yeah.
is,
Eligibility.
in the chapter, you know,
The grid of intelligibility. Yeah.
yeah, grid of intelligibility, and then you you talked, and the principle of German model of a Vitalpolitik is a vital, you know, Vitalpolitics, and then
Which is
you know,
where Foucault got the origin of the notion of Biopolitique. Comes from the ordoliberal economic tradition which he was studying at that time. Yeah.
And then you actually connect, you know, that concept is to you know, Deleuze, you know, the concept of society of control. Is it you know, quite, you know, connected to that Deleuze, you know, very ambiguous, you know, concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means
well, it's a problem of translation, because Foucault, he takes the notion of Vitalpolitik comes from the ordoliberal or the economic theorist Rousseau, who wrote a 4-volume work on this, and then he talked about this is where the origin of the social market theory, of the German social market theory, came from these Rousseau and also another theory, Ropke. Both of them were exiled during the period of of National Socialism, and came back to form basically the grounding theory. The Freiburg School grounded the theory of the German social market theory after World War II. And so Vitalpolitik was a concept or a term that was invented by Rousseau. And it's where Foucault actually draws a certain kind of inspiration of his understanding of the biopolitics, which is that a completely transformed relation of economic theory to the study of the distribution and the commercium of societies, of cycles of distribution, that he did the previous year in the lecture on security. So what Foucault identifies as control in the 80s is really what Foucault would identify as the regime or the system of security that emerges as the dominant principle, organizing principle of the new techniques of power. But this emerges in the 18th century or the 19th century. It doesn't emerge. It doesn't emerge in 1980. So in other words, Foucault's studying a very historical aggregation of new areas and new forms or techniques of state control, state that have to do with security, which can be easily demonstrated today by referring to the pandemic and the relation of the state to the pandemic, to population. You know, to population is the object of the state. The individual attitude or conduct is not as much the concern of the state as the attitude of an entire group or a population, as well as the borders or the boundaries between populations. So this transforms geopolitically the relation of the states and the notion of the state, state knowledge, or the raison d'être, raison d'etat, you know. So, and so this is what Foucault's really writing about, is the separation between what he called earlier on disciplinary knowledge, you know, which concerns primarily the juridical relation of the state to its own form of security and the individual's, the soul of the individual and the soul of the state, and concerning the freedom of the individual and the security of the state, to a completely different set of techniques concerning security, which includes, this is the whole notion, which is completely misunderstood, because in society must be defended. It's in the later chapter, or actually it's taken out of the last chapter of History of Sexuality, where this is placed in a relation of to not kill, but to let live, you know, that notion of a new order of power or sovereignty, which is not based upon violence or the threat of killing or murder or state violence, but it's based upon the allowing to live. Actually, that develops in much more a fine-grained analysis develops in the lecture of 1978 on security and populations, where it is this whole array of new knowledges that concern with how do we avoid the collapse of the state due to famine, or interestingly enough, due to contagion or epidemics, as in the case of the smallpox epidemic. And this becomes more of a concern of the state than individual liberty or freedom. And so that's the area of where biopolitics develops.
Mhm.
I kind of think I can carry on with that, because I was wondering about what you meant by the enterprise society.
Yeah.
Because you started to talk about the society of control, and then maybe out of that a kind of new, what do you say, a new kind of homo economicus, a new mode of subjectification almost that comes out of that. And then I guess what would be the new object of power that we can understand in this kind of enterprise society? Because when I was thinking about your idea of this, of what an enterprise society is, then I was thinking about a little bit about Stiegler and about his idea that society, we know our society is one of disinhibition and disruption, and how would that work? What is the nature of this kind of enterprise society, as you say, which is somehow stripped of all science fiction, is what you say in the book. So I was
Stripped of all what? Stripped of all what?
You say stripped of all science fiction.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about then what would be the kind of emergent dispositif of control? What is this thing that is coming from the future that you can imagine in this kind of new enterprise society that, yeah.
Okay, look, where Deleuze actually gets the notion of contrôler is in the French from the idea of a remote control.
Mm.
Okay. Now, even from Bentham, okay, so you gotta remember that Foucault is talking about really from the 17th century. So the object of Foucault's analysis in The Birth of Biopolitics is not the 20th century. It is after the 17th century and into the 18th century. So the emergence of a new homo economicus he's talking about is actually already emerging within the context of late liberalism, within the context of liberalism. So a new form of homo economicus, but the ideal theory, as he talks about, of liberalism, was a form of state control that didn't have, that was not coercive, that was not directly coercive of the individual liberty, but seemed to operate from a distance, from a remote distance. And the ideal for Bentham, of course, was the panopticon, that, you know, the idea that everybody felt that they were under surveillance in some ways, and so they behaved according to a certain norm or pattern. And in doing so, then a certain kind of order that is juridical could be enforced without direct violence or coercion by the state, which would be an anathema to a notion of individual liberty that the market depended upon. So in a sense, it was this careful balancing act between free market, between the development of a free market society and the form of the state and of the knowledges of the state to control that market. And without, so Foucault began looking at the development of that new economic rationality that after Mill and after others that emerged within both the economic theory, but in the new techniques of the state in terms of how it exerted control over the market, as well as over populations and individuals. So it's important to keep in mind that that Foucault's reference here to enterprise, he talks about enterprise must be understood at almost a molecular level, that the individual is simply a bundle of a number of enterprises, all of which have value, without referring necessarily to the individual subject or form as the unity of those enterprises. So, I mean, this is very easy to explain in the manner in which today the network has evolved around understanding our consumption, our reading, our everything. Everything can be molecularized, broken down and analyzed in terms of different aspects of acts, passions, instincts, wants, needs that don't have the individual as a subject as a unity. And I think that that's what Foucault is really trying to address is this phenomenon of both economic rationality as well as forms of or techniques of knowledge and control associated. Every time there's knowledge, there's control.
Mhm.
There is no such thing as knowledge without control.
Yeah.
So anytime you have Google, you have a database that can be used by third parties to do whatever, okay? So any new technology, and this responds also but not to Manaj's question earlier, breathes an infinite possibilities that we do not yet know. They never conceived the technology coercively to be used in that fashion, but the technology in itself, in a sense, can be adapted and used later on by a form or a technique of power. And so this is something that Foucault was very constantly sensitive to in these epistemological shifts, radical epistemological shifts in both knowledge and power, basically. That's it.
Mm.
Can I pitch in, Alex?
Mm.
Yeah, Alex was asking the question in the beginning about the if there is any discontinuity between the Foucauldian overall project. Like one major distinction would be the archaeological phase and the genealogical phase, like something which ended with archaeology of knowledge and then starting with discipline and punish and leading on to the lectures that we are discussing right now. My question is simply this. Like, what was puzzling me after reading Order of Things and reading these later lectures is that his reversal to a kind of a neo-Kantian position of neo-Kantian subjective position, where like he made a major statement in Order of Things about the death of the human, like the human being being the product of like being constituted by three disciplines, wherein which you say Homo economicus, biology, and speaking man, language.
Mm.
And it has internal contradictions as well. And it is not something that he explained us in terms of like human as something which which has othered the female or the other things, but or problems that were internal to the construction of human, the man as a being, like in all these human disciplines. And so do we think that, like, if there is a continuity, how do you relate these different positions that Foucault take, like in Order of Things, and then his return to kind of a neo-Kantian subjective position in later lectures?
Well, that's it. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, but before I get to that, I mean, to the question of enlightenment, Aufklärung, which he returns very late, a lot of the later lectures is addressing that. I think very particularly in relation to the development of a certain kind of philosophy or theory in France at that time, he's developing that question of what constitutes enlightenment. But I would just say that, I mean, what you're referring to is the concluding chapters of the Order of Things.
Yes.
On the organization of the sciences humaines, you know, of the human sciences, you know, which is a 19th century or 18th, 19th century formation that takes over from the dominance of grammar, philology, and labor, the study of a certain kind of economics or classification.
Analysis of wealth, taxonomy, and philology.
In philology, yeah, that's right. So those three, okay, those three areas that guide the whole discussion: life, labor, language. That guide the discussion. But life, labor, language, understood to a very classical array or Renaissance array of knowledges of those disciplines, right? If you look at the very opening in 1978 of the lecture, security, government, security, populations, territory, you will see that he actually returns exactly to that last chapter of the human sciences and reorganizes his whole epistemology around these three areas. Areas that, in a sense, assume the new techniques or new knowledges that concern the analysis of wealth is replaced by the new economic theory and the economic sciences. Philology is replaced by a different form of analysis of language, or of the sign, particularly of semiology. And then labor is replaced by a different form of economic calculation, or in a sense, certainly the struggle over an understanding of the organization of labor or of human capital. And it's all situated on the level of populations. What's interesting is that this is what I talked about as the discovery of the fourth element of Foucault, which is milieu. Milieu is the middle, it means the middle. And he discovers that in a sense, in between, there's a really powerful statement that he makes at the end of this introduction to the lectures there, which guides them actually all the way through the birth of Biopolitics. It guides his whole trajectory of his analysis. He says that that the sovereign doesn't disappear, but the sovereign has a new trajectory or target to transform not man, but the human species. But it's at the intersection between nature, changes in climate, famine, poverty, contagion, and the human nature that he says that the new sovereign intervenes precisely in that milieu, which is in the middle of that. Well, what's in the middle of that milieu but the body of populations, territory, and security is the apparatus that, in a sense, becomes the formalized area of knowledge that's not organized in the university, but is organized by the state. So I would say that that is the major epistemological shift there. In terms of the late writings, when he returns to the question of critique and Aufklärung of the Kantian, I don't know, that's a very interesting, because I've written on that quite a bit over my career. I've written on Foucault's Kantianism.
Okay.
I'm not sure that he's returning to the transcendental subject as much in the Kantian sense as it really is. He's returning to the very conditions by which he talks about how truth proceeds through a traumatic encounter with error, with the errors of life.
Okay.
So he says that there are three great biopolitical philosophies. One is Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit. The second is Kant's third critique, which is the critique of judgment. And he said there, philosophy encounters that truth, in effect, is derivative from an epical or a rupture that is caused by the errors of life. And if you could think about the notion of taste or individual taste of the aesthetic, that's in the sense where Kant is trying to deal with monstrosity and what doesn't follow a norm or follow a law, what breaks the law in sense of a regulation of philosophy, the ideas of reason. And so I think that's why he returns to Kant. I think more to resolve that problem of genealogy, particularly of the different epistemes of philosophy, or the different, what he calls the will to truth in terms of its history.
So I wanted to get back to the question of state and the power. You actually talked about the state controlled the body of a human being. For instance, actually, population. Yeah. And then you said actually the Foucauldian concept of power is not kind of coercive, the control over the people. That means actually the concept of power presupposes kind of decentralized, the mechanism. But the state must actually control, people from some place, even though we said that is very distansive actually control behind, yourself. But that means if we said control, that means somebody, whatever called is a sovereign or, some machine or whatever called is Google these days, mechanical then is a surveillance, even actually we got this concept, surveillance capitalism. That means actually big brother there, and then always this big other, try to control the people. This actually needs quite the centralized power. But as you said, is this situation, pre-support that decentralized, non-coercive power control over the people. So how can we actually put these, concept together, or is this, both concept, could be compatible?
Well, I mean, I guess you continue to use the term control in a way of a coercive or a form of domination.
Yeah, exactly.
In a classical political theory from Machiavelli onward, where that the state, the prince must rule and even use violence prudently, in other words, but always with a concern. Prudence in Machiavelli is a concern that too much violence does harm to the state, because it provokes a reaction on the part of the populace, and that's the theory of classical politics, or classical political theory. So I abandon in my book, or my analysis, I really kind of argue against the entire Deleuzian reading of Foucault, which has led us on, which is Deleuze's real, I think a very conservative, neoconservative reaction to the emergence of neoliberalism in post-Derrigist France in the 1980s. Okay, so it's similar to the United States. It was like everything is now it's about the state now assuming control through other forms of governmentality, like the corporations, like the social services, like the police. So the state is no longer centralized. We no longer have an enemy. This was the problem with the left. We don't have an enemy, to confront anymore, because the state has dispersed itself into all of these peripheral and capillary forms of power and control, and therefore we no longer have an opponent. Well, this was really brilliant on part of the state, right? It was a way of hiding in plain sight to some degree, by dispersing the forms of its, I would not say control, but forms of stimulation, of movement, of productivity, of activity, of economy, of profit, that would attract the individual as if by their own will to act and behave in certain patterns that conform to the state's own ends, to the ends established by the state. So that becomes, in a sense, the aim of the new knowledges, because direct, overt confrontation or violence is completely contradictory to the idea of market society, to individuals operating freely in order to gain profit from their own activity, as well as to feel that they have freedom to pursue their own ends. So you don't have a state coming in and saying, you can't do this and you can't do that. What you do is you have a state that is dispersed into forms of regulation and control of traffic and movement, that shapes patterns of behavior by profit and by incentive in order to coerce without violence. It's no less coercive, right? The current economy, or what's happening in the humanities in the university, is a case in point. It's about a defunding of a whole sector of knowledge and techniques, in a sense, not by, in a sense, by closing them down. The state doesn't close down the Department of Queer Studies or Gender Studies. What it does is it just slowly kills it by defunding it. So that, in a sense, the individual doesn't have any incentive to pursue that area of knowledge. And eventually the knowledge is extinct, as well as the forms of activity that are related to that knowledge. In other words, the knowledges of sexuality, or the knowledges of the active political activism that might emerge from that kind of intellectual activity. So that's, I think, what that would be the way to articulate those two areas together. The state, which pursues its own ends or its own aims indirectly through a number of different techniques that are decentralized. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any more?
Yeah, I have a question. It's a little bit connected to what you just explained brilliantly, but obviously your book is all about diagram and the dispositif. And as I went through it, I was looking for I was trying to make sense of the dispositif, basically. And then thinking about the diagram, and are they the same thing? Or is the dispositif somehow the same as the abstract machine in Deleuze? And I was trying to think, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But well, I was wondering why there's no mention of the abstract machine in your book. And I guess you kind of just explained that it's not about control as such, or this kind of forms of transparent domination, but the dispositif is something getting away from the kind of apparatus, right? Or
Yes,
something
yeah.
like, that's how you kind of explain it, isn't it? You don't need to invoke like the structure or the system or organism, something like that. So is that what the dispositif is?
Yeah,
Is that precisely that's what it is?
that's precisely what it is. Yeah. And it's what Foucault revolutionized an understanding of how power functions, no longer through the notion of apparats, is based upon mechanism or a mechanistic knowledge,
Right.
which again seem to explain or provide an analogy of how power functions, like a machine,
Right.
which is in Marx as well,
Right.
which is then gradually replaced by a notion of structure, but all the elements of a structure have to be homogeneous to the structure. See, Foucault, his use of dispositif, he was in a sense a way to derealize or to defamiliarize the previous paradigms or the previous, let's say, metaphors or the previous symbolic typosis, as Kant would call, the manners in which we represented power as functioning according to a certain organization of technology and science and knowledge, right?
Right.
So it was the dispositif didn't correspond to that. In fact, he kind of like completely reversed the role by saying that apparatuses are actually included and institutions are inside dispositifs, but without constituting their interiority. So there's a certain kind of paradoxical logic at work in the way that Foucault wants to defamiliarize the manner in which we've represented, the manner in which certain knowledges and disciplines have represented power, including political theory, for over 500 years. So, and how that has evolved. And that's my long discussion of the gradual replacement of organism by mechanism from the 17th century through the 19th century, so that mechanism becomes a natural metaphor or representation of power. Well, how did that come to pass? Okay, no, it comes to pass through historical process of precisely situating mechanism as the representation of power. So
the dispositif
it has to be done in
an
several different disciplines.
So it is.
Yeah.
It's not the abstract machine. You wouldn't make it those things synonymous,
No.
right there.
No.
I see. And then the diagram and the dispositif. How would you explain the difference between them?
Again, it's very interesting how influential Deleuze's reading of Foucault has been to represent Foucault's project, because these terms or concept like diagram really come from Deleuze and not from Foucault. It comes from Deleuze's representation of Foucault and not from Foucault's own usage of the terms to describe or to define the elements of his own project. And so that's one of the reasons my book tries to defamiliarize in a certain way the manner in which this generation or our current generation has really received our Foucault from Deleuze and not from Foucault himself. And in doing so, I think that there's there's a productive way of understanding that Deleuze was trying to rescue Foucault immediately after his death, when he was being demonized by the French Academy and by the intellectuals in France, and that there was a strong urge to forget his entire project. So it was a way, as Deleuze himself says, it was a way of monumentalizing Foucault's project. But Deleuze can't touch anything without making it Deleuzian. Okay, so that was the other problem. In other words, there was also, I could read this in a very contrary way, in saying this was a very passive-aggressive move on Deleuze's part to finally win an argument that he could never win when Foucault was alive. In other words, to represent the entire system of a philosopher who he had a traumatic breakup with and an enormous fight, he finally won the argument by actually being the one to actually write his obituary. So in some ways, I see in a very Nietzschean way that there's both, you know, this is beyond good and evil. This is a certain kind of way that philosophy is done, right? So it's post-truth, you know, even before the post-truth. Yeah. So.
Any more?
I just want a clarification on the comment that you just made. It's like diagram is something which Deleuze takes from Foucault, right? It's from Discipline and Punish, right? It borrows that concept. It's from Discipline and Punish, right?
Yeah.
That where Deleuze takes it from. It's maybe he's appropriating in his own way, but it's there in Foucault, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but in what way is it there, and how does he utilize it in a globalizing way of understanding? Foucault understood it as a major element or component of the manner in which Foucault organizes his epistemology in some ways. It's certainly there. I mean, when you speak of Discipline and Punish, the diagram of the panopticon is referred to as a diagram, right? Mm-hmm. But Foucault didn't invent that. He takes that from Bentham, right? You know, it's the manner in which Bentham's, okay, so this is an interesting point. It's a manner in which Bentham's panopticon, okay, suddenly becomes a diagram of all power relations, right? That all power is a panopticon, okay, in every institution, okay, and you know, and that's how the inflation of the concept or of a certain element or a diagram becomes in globalizing in a way that I don't think that Foucault intended that diagram to be used that universally, let's say. But it's the problem that I'm addressing in terms of how we're always looking for a certain kind of representation in a very Kantian sense to represent something unrepresentable, which is power.
Is that why you have the idea of the curvature? You use that. Is that the idea? Because I think I had to go over it several times. So it'd be great if you could just kind of spell out why that is kind of an essential move in your kind of explanation of the diagram. Could you?
Okay, so I mean, it's in a way that, I mean, it does correspond in a way to the conditions of to what Kant called the ideas of reason, right? That are regulative rather than epistemological. And he said that the transcendental illusion of reason was that when we take an idea of reason, okay, and we think it is a concept of understanding. So the ideas of reason are God, world, and soul, okay? Each of these correspond to an idea of reason because they're metaphysical ideas that have no corresponding object epistemologically. So, for instance, the world cannot be grasped in one intuition and demands multiple or a multiple assemblage of different perspectives and intuitions that demand geometrical and mathematical knowledge and that sort of thing. So in a sense, but there are certain kinds of ways in which we represent a world as if it is a holistic or unified vision of an object or one thing, okay? So that's one way that I apply that notion of a regulative idea. of the diagram as has a regulative function, but it's not, in a sense, it is not an epistemological function in that way.
Right. I see. Because when I was looking at that idea of curvature, I was thinking, well, one of the things about people say about Foucault, he doesn't account for change as such. I mean, why one episteme or why one diagram rather than another? But then I thought about this curvature. I don't know, maybe this is completely wrong, but I was thinking about this idea of curvature. Again, it's not a representation, as you say, of the world, right?
Yeah.
But I thought that might kind of, how can I explain it? That idea of curvature might reveal something by the very act of its non-representational function. Mm-hmm. So then it would be almost like, it'd be like a bit like Wittgenstein, really.
Yeah.
About something is kind of revealed in like a puzzle, if something, an anomaly comes forth. But right. I guess after your explanation, my idea, what I had yesterday is completely wrong.
It must be a late Wittgenstein. Late Wittgenstein, yeah, it's not the early one.
Right. I mean, does that make sense? Because that was something.
Yeah, no, I think Foucault was very interested, like I talked about, the notion of a paradoxical logic.
Right.
That would be related to Wittgenstein. But I think I talk about, I mean, I'm trying to remember, I can't remember right offhand, but yeah, the curvature of space is only one of the points. There are 4 points, right? Mm-hmm. In which power, I begin with a proposition, power is not an organism, it's not a structure, so it is to deconstruct these analogies that have historically represented power as a thing. But the notion of curvature, as well as the notion of intersubjectivity and that sort of thing, it was about how power, in a sense, never lines up in the field of representation in that same way.
Right. Mm.
So yeah, but your intuition that Wittgenstein would be a corollary here. I mean, Foucault himself, in 1978, he went to Japan, and he gave a lecture that's you should read it. It's called The Analytic Philosophy of Politics.
Right.
In which he proposed, and this was right during the time that he was lecturing on biopolitics, as well as after the security populations, after history of sexuality. He proposed that there should be more of a Wittgensteinian or analytical philosophy approach to the question of politics that doesn't function through big paradigmatic kind of forms of power relations. In other words, it would be able to deal then with the micro-physical as well as the molecular level of how power functions by developing a knowledge, analytical knowledge that would function along the lines of a certain kind of logic, that I think would have a very close resemblance to Wittgenstein.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
Well, I was just reading about Foucault in Japan, because I read your book and that lecture came to mind. And it's a wonderful story about, just because Taekwondo was talking about Iran, and then Foucault became very interested in what the Orient offered, right? And then there's that kind of interest he had in some kind of understanding of Zen Buddhism and what that might kind of offer as a rival kind of, rival to the West. So there's much in the Japanese about his kind of visit and his frustrations about being in Japan and about not understanding like no drama and things like that, and being frustrated the lack of language and being that kind of Roland Barthes kind of idea of being enveloped in signs he doesn't understand, and that kind of thing. So I'm going to try and get into it a bit more, kind of picked up on it. So thanks for that.
Well, that would be fantastic. Yeah, because it's a very little known episode. Even that little essay, it's not translated in English, so it's only in Digne écrit. So it's a very interesting, and there are several conversations. One with a Japanese group. I got the page here in Digne écrit, in Kyoto, we had a conversation on the disciplinary society in crisis. So there's a very interesting set of conversations that he had there that seemed to be very different than conversations that he would have in the United States or in France at the same time.
Yeah, he was there in Kyoto and then Osaka and then in Tokyo, of course, and things like that. So you kind of spurred me on to kind of get back into Foucault, so thanks for that.
Yeah, no, I think that would be very interesting, particularly from where you're coming, so yeah.
All right, so I think time's going on. So
we should we haven't. You have another book coming out.
Yeah, just we need
a plug,
introduction of a new book. You actually turn to be a writing machine these days, lockdown writing machine.
Yeah, even though I rejected the notion of machine. I rejected the notion of machine and everywhere, but I am
writing
unstoppable machine.
No, there can't be a writing dispositive because dispositive just doesn't work. That's like that.
Yeah.
What is the title of your book? Is Toward a Geopolitical Image of Thought.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's two books that are out. One is, a long book that I was writing when I was with Alex in Seoul, and then
people are missing.
The people are missing, which is on the concept of minor literature today, but it's really on the question of the destination of literature and a certain kind of revolutionary understanding of literature. So the concept of minor literature, the minor literature in Deleuze and Guattari. But where is it today? Or even where is it 10 years after Deleuze and Guattari wrote the book? Because it kind of disappears immediately. So if you look at the cinema too, that's where everything is converted. Deleuze then situates more that revolutionary condition in minor cinema, the cinema of the third world, and only in certain directors that could say that the people are missing. So it becomes a very interesting displacement of this mission of a certain kind of modernist understanding of the literary question. And then the geopolitical image of towards the geopolitical image of thought. Well, that's kind of a summa or a summation of all my about 20 years of writing on Deleuze and Guattari, and kind of it contains basically everything that I know and about a certain area of the question of the question of geophilosophy, which will also be in the next book. But in this book, I declare that basically I will never write another book on Deleuze again. And after writing 8 or 9 of them or something like that, that I'm done. And then Alex invites me to give a lecture, and I'm writing another book on Deleuze. So so I can only say after Nietzsche, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. So yeah. But no, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot. I have another book on called "The World Is Gone," and it's on the pandemic, and it's on Heidegger. So more recently, over the last year or so, I've been really reading and really reading through Heidegger's work, starting with Being and Time, but all the way up through the 29 lectures and so forth on the concept of world, and then afterwards into that tradition that follows that, Levinas and others. So and also Deleuze wrote a very early essay called what is grounding? What is basically what is a ground? So I'm very interested in the ground, the notion of ground or world. And so that will be what I'll write on next.
Good. I look forward to that very much.
Yeah. All right. So we must stop here. It's already 1 hour and 20 minutes went on.
Alex, where are you in your office or at home?
My home.
Oh, okay.
It's like my office. All right. It's actually my working library. I think you visited here, so I don't think I ever.
I don't think I ever was in that office. Yeah.
Yeah, this
So-
is actually my working library in my home. I
okay.
got more books. I bought this one from China.
Yeah, I
It's
noticed that.
covering.
Alex has got more books than anybody, I think. You know, so yeah.
Yeah.
Also got your books, anyway. All right, so thank you for coming and joining this workshop. And actually our workshop is a lecture series will go on, all right, to colleagues and then my old friend Greg, very fantastic talk. And then this book is a very timely, publication about, Foucault and revival of Foucault. We must reinterpret, Foucault at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way to end it. We must reinterpret Foucault. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. That's our conclusion. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, see you soon.